started when I was doing work in the 1980s and 90s in Washington. I was very involved with legislative issues and access to government information, and I chaired an initiative that created a coalition of 50 groups in Washington, groups like the ACLU and scientists and other types of groups that are interested in ensuring openness. And what I discovered in that effort is that there was a lot of conflict. And the conflict was not just between those who didn't agree with us. There was a lot of conflict between us and people we did with. And so I started getting interested in conflict management, which had started a program at the graduate school where I graduated from at NYU Public Administration. And I started to see how conflict management gets people at the table talking to each other. And I thought this was really interesting. But I didn't really like the idea that the whole basis of it was conflict, and not just sort of how do we work through issues as a democracy. And what you realize when you start working together on where you are on issues and really bringing each other out when you're talking with people who don't necessarily agree with you, is that you often agree on a lot more things than you think. And you often disagree with people that you thought you agreed with on some things. So that we have many, many different ways to view an issue. And so I became much more aware of that. And in the meantime, I also became very concerned with democracy because access to government information was supposed to be about democracy. So I became very interested in the idea of the informed citizen. But what struck me was, as more and more information was available to the public, it didn't necessarily elicit more and more participation in our democracy. And so this notion that an informed citizenry is essential to a democracy, I started to think about, well, why aren't they participating in democracy if they're better informed than they used to be? So as I worked through some of those issues and started questioning what is democracy, that prompted me when I became ALA president to actually launch my Libraries and Democracy Initiative. Now that initiative, it was my presidential program, you could call it. What I wanted to do was delve further into the ideas that were always thrown out. I'd always heard, libraries were connected to democracy and we were essential to democracy. But I wanted to think about that. What does that really mean? So as I delved into it, I got more and more involved in democracy literature and understanding different views of democracy, and started looking at what does it really mean to participate in a democracy. So I looked at different models. Either you could look at presidents. Presidents like Johnson looked at democracy as voting. Presidents like Clinton looked at democracy as governance. But presidents like Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, looked at democracy as participation. And participation was what I started to really focus on. So what is the role of libraries in not just creating an informed citizenry, but a citizenry that has opportunities to participate in democracy? And to me, that is really at the essence of what the public library is about. So when we talk about this as an idea evolving, it goes right back to the heart of where we started with Benjamin Franklin. So Franklin's idea was that libraries should be for the masses, not just for, what he considered the masses, not just for the elite. So in Europe, libraries were for either royalty or the church. And this is a very novel, revolutionary idea. So more than 100 years after he started his first so-called lending library, we had the public library movement in the 1850s. And if you look at the original missions of these libraries in New England, a lot of them talked about the role in democracy and the importance of involvement in civic work. So this is not really a new idea to libraries. It's an idea that's been around, but it sort of peaks and ebbs as the whole notion of democracy peaks and ebbs in America. So in the early 20th century, libraries started getting involved as informal public libraries, as informal education centers, and focusing on equipping the public to participate in a democracy, the whole notion of the People's University and creating a citizenry capable of being schooled in democratic life. And so these notions have been around a long time. After World War II, there was a big movement led by the American Library Association and the New York Public Library to create libraries as places as agents for democratic living. And they had discussions around the country and basically these citizen conversations. In 1952, they had a big effort to get people to vote, to participate in voting. So your interest in voting in 2000, this has been going on for many years at public libraries. It just peaks and wanes. So toward the end of the 20th century, there are a lot of scholars that were looking at, what's happening that we are not participating as actively in our democracy. And one of those was Robert Putnam, who was my speaker at ALA right after he published Bowling Alone. And he basically said that citizenship is not a spectator sport. And his research showed, though, that active citizenship had really diminished over the last, say, 30 years of the 20th century. So he really prompted a public awareness, and certainly awareness among librarians, if they hadn't been, that something needed to be done. So there's been a lot of action going on around the country to get the public to be more engaged as agents of democracy, that they really have a role as citizens to play. It's not just waiting for someone like a leader to come and save us, but it's really finding ways that we as Americans can work together. So that's what prompted me to see libraries as a critical player in all this. So why libraries? Well, those who talk about this need to reclaim democracy, our role as citizens in a democracy, there were forums all around the country on this very topic about 5 years ago. And what citizens said was that they really did want to engage, but there were not safe spaces. They needed places, trustworthy places they could go to feel safe. So can you go to a mall and have conversations about your democracy? Well, probably not. So where is the obvious place in our communities? Well, to me and to many public libraries, they'd like to see themselves as that agora, that place where people can feel safe to exchange ideas. Now, we talk about libraries as a place that are safe for a diversity of ideas, for access to those ideas. So taking that one step further, in a participatory democracy, we want people not to just have access to ideas where, say, Lenin and Hitler's books can be on the shelf safely next to each other, but we also create a place, a physical place, or a safe haven where the public can come and feel that they can exchange those ideas. So Ray Oldenburg refers to it as the great good place, and he sees libraries as those kinds of places essential to political processes of democracy. So this idea is out there. It's out there not just among librarians, but the public at large. I mean, I've done a whole lot of work over the years with the public, not just with librarians, but with the public. And the public gets that libraries can and should be this place. I think our challenge is to convince librarians. Some are very well convinced. Others still need convincing that they play a role. Now, this is not a political role. This is being a place where people can feel safe to exchange ideas. The library should not be taking a position on those ideas, but giving a place, a public forum, where the public can feel safe. Now, there's other ways that we also enhance democracy. We do it through being government depositories. Now we're involved with e-democracy. We do it with all kinds of, book discussion groups. We do it just by being a physical place where people can have their small groups, the kinds of groups that de Tocqueville talked about, these associations in America. So libraries have many roles to play, but I think the challenge for us now is how do we take a more active role in this whole way of creating civic agency, being agents of democracy.